Blackwell Unburdened. Fleeing an unwanted marriage, Lady Beatrice of Blackmere found herself at the gates of Sir Geoffrey de Moray's fortress, a place of exile and legend. He watched her from the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You should not have come here, my lady," he murmured. "Now, I fear you will never leave." Chapter 1. The Falcon's Flight. The wind, a razor-edged blade honed on the distant peaks, whipped at Lady Beatrice of Blackmere's cloak, threatening to tear the heavy wool from her shoulders. It howled a mournful song, a counterpoint to the frantic rhythm of her horse's hooves against the frozen earth. Behind her, Blackmere, her ancestral home, was a dwindling silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, its familiar towers and battlements receding into the gathering gloom like a fading memory. Each frantic stride of the mare was a desperate prayer, a plea to a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. She had been running for days, ever since the missive had arrived, bearing the royal seal and Lord Ashworth's smug signature. The king, in his infinite wisdom, had decreed her betrothal to Ashworth, a man twice her age, with a reputation as cold and cruel as the northern winters. A man whose touch, she knew, would be a violation, not a caress. She had pleaded with her father, the Earl of Blackmere, but his eyes, usually filled with a gruff affection, had been distant, shuttered. "It is the king's will, Beatrice," he had said, his voice heavy with a resignation that chilled her more than the winter wind. "There is no recourse." But there was recourse, a desperate, reckless gamble. The memory of a whispered conversation, a childhood story told by her old nurse, had surfaced in her mind, a tale of a fortress to the north, a place of exile and legend, ruled by a lord shrouded in mystery. Sir Geoffrey de Moray, the Winter Lord, they called him. A man who had once been a celebrated knight, a hero of the southern wars, now banished to the fringes of the kingdom for a crime no one dared speak of openly. A man who, it was said, offered sanctuary to those who had nowhere else to turn. Beatrice clutched the reins tighter, her knuckles bone-white against the worn leather. Her breath plumed out in frosty clouds, mingling with the rising mist that swirled around the base of the towering crags. The landscape was stark, unforgiving, a tapestry woven from shades of gray and white. Even the trees, their branches skeletal and bare, seemed to hold their breath, waiting. The air itself crackled with a primal energy, a sense of ancient secrets buried deep beneath the frozen earth. She had traded her fine silks for a sturdy, travel-worn gown, her jeweled slippers for practical, if somewhat ill-fitting, boots. Her elaborate braids, the hallmark of a noblewoman, had been hastily undone, replaced by a single, thick plait that bounced against her back with every jarring step. She had stripped herself of all outward signs of her station, hoping to blend into the anonymity of the wilderness, to become just another nameless traveler seeking shelter from the storm. But beneath the rough exterior, the fear remained, a cold knot in her stomach. Fear of Ashworth, fear of her father's disappointment, and a deeper, more primal fear of the unknown that lay ahead. What if the stories were false? What if the Winter Lord was not a refuge, but another cage, more gilded perhaps, but a cage nonetheless? As dusk deepened into night, the silhouette of the fortress finally emerged from the swirling mist. It was not a castle in the traditional sense, with soaring turrets and graceful arches. Instead, it was a brutal, uncompromising structure, carved from the living rock of the mountain itself. Walls of dark, unyielding stone rose sheer from the precipice, punctuated by narrow, arrow-slit windows that glowed faintly with the light of unseen fires within. It looked less like a home and more like a prison, a place where secrets were kept and souls were tested. The main gate, a massive oak and iron affair, was closed, guarded by two silent figures clad in heavy furs and chain mail. They watched her approach, their faces obscured by the shadows of their helms, their hands resting on the hilts of their swords. Beatrice drew her horse to a halt a few yards from the gate, her heart hammering against her ribs. She swallowed, trying to moisten her dry throat. "I seek sanctuary," she called out, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I am Lady Beatrice of Blackmere, and I beg the Lord of Moray's protection." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, broken only by the mournful cry of a distant hawk circling high above. One of the guards stepped forward, his footsteps crunching on the frozen ground. He held a lantern aloft, its flickering light illuminating his face, a face etched with the harsh lines of a life lived on the edge, but not unkind. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have been expecting you. Or, rather, someone resembling your description." Beatrice frowned. "Expecting me? How is that possible?" The guard gave a slight shrug. "The Winter Lord has ways of knowing things. He sees much from these walls." He gestured towards the towering fortress. "Dismount, my lady. You are weary, and the night is cold. The Lord will see you." She slid from the saddle, her legs stiff and aching from the long ride. The guard took the reins of her horse, leading it towards a stable built into the side of the cliff. Beatrice followed him, her gaze drawn upwards, towards the imposing figure that had appeared in the doorway of the fortress. He stood silhouetted against the warm glow of the interior, a tall, broad-shouldered figure clad in dark furs and leather. His face was in shadow, his expression unreadable. He was like a figure from a legend, a warrior king from a bygone age, both forbidding and strangely compelling. A shiver ran down Beatrice's spine, a mixture of fear and a strange, unsettling anticipation. He descended the steps, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the heavy boots he wore. As he drew closer, the light from the guard's lantern caught his features, revealing a face that was both striking and deeply unsettling. High cheekbones, a strong jawline, and eyes that were the color of a winter sky, cold and piercing, yet holding a depth of sorrow that seemed to reach into her very soul. There were scars, too, a network of fine lines that spoke of battles fought and wounds endured. He was older than she had imagined, perhaps in his late 30s, but his age only added to the aura of power and experience that surrounded him. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her from head to toe, taking in every detail of her appearance, her worn clothing, her wind-chapped face, the defiant tilt of her chin. The silence stretched between them, taut and heavy, filled with unspoken questions and unacknowledged fears. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low, resonant murmur that seemed to vibrate in the cold night air. "You should not have come here, my lady," he murmured, his words echoing the guard's earlier sentiment. "Now, I fear you will never leave." He paused before finishing the sentiment, the winter air catching between them, carrying unspoken warnings. Chapter 2. Sanctuary of Stone. His words hung in the air, not a threat, but a lament. A statement of fact, tinged with a weariness that resonated deep within Beatrice's own exhaustion. She looked up at him, meeting his gaze, trying to decipher the enigma behind those ice-blue eyes. Was it pity she saw there? Resignation? Or something else, something darker, hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed composure? "I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice a little hoarse. She wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly feeling the biting cold more acutely. "Lord Ashworth, he would have forced me. My father, he could not or would not help me. Sir Geoffrey de Moray," for she was certain now that it was him, studied her for a long moment, his expression unchanging. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he gestured towards the open doorway. "Come inside, Lady Beatrice. We will speak further. The walls of Moray offer sanctuary, as you requested. But sanctuary comes at a price." The interior of the fortress was a stark contrast to the bleak, windswept landscape outside. The great hall was vast and imposing, the walls lined with ancient tapestries depicting scenes of battles and hunts, their colors faded but still vibrant. A massive fireplace dominated one end of the room, a roaring fire casting dancing shadows on the stone floor and high, vaulted ceiling. The air was warm, scented with the aroma of wood smoke and roasting meat, a welcome change from the biting chill she had endured for days. Several figures were gathered around the fire, their faces turned towards her as she entered, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and caution. There were men at arms, clad in leather and chainmail, their hands never far from their weapons. There were women, too, some dressed in the simple garb of servants, others in more elaborate, if somewhat dated, gowns, their expressions hinting at a shared history, a shared exile. Sir Geoffrey led her towards a smaller, more intimate chamber off the main hall. It was a library, of sorts, lined with shelves filled with books and scrolls, their leather bindings worn and cracked with age. A single window, narrow and deep-set, offered a breathtaking view of the moonlit valley below. A fire burned brightly in a smaller hearth, casting a warm, inviting glow over the room. He gestured towards a chair, a heavy, ornately carved piece of furniture that looked as if it had been there for centuries. "Sit, Lady Beatrice. You must be tired." She sank into the chair, grateful for the respite. He remained standing, leaning against the mantelpiece, his arms crossed over his chest, his gaze still fixed on her. The silence stretched between them, punctuated only by the crackling of the fire and the distant murmur of voices from the great hall. "Tell me," he said finally, his voice low and even. "Tell me everything. Why did you flee Blackmere? Why did you seek refuge here, in this forgotten place?" And so she did. She told him of the forced betrothal, of Ashworth's cruelty, of her father's inability to protect her. She told him of the whispered stories, of the Winter Lord's reputation, of the hope that had driven her north, through the storm and the darkness. She held nothing back, laying bare her fears, her desperation, her vulnerability. He listened in silence, his expression unchanging, his eyes never leaving hers. It was unnerving, this intense scrutiny, as if he were looking not just at her, but into her, searching for some hidden truth, some flaw in her story. When she had finished, he remained silent for a long moment, his gaze shifting to the fire, his brow furrowed in thought. "You understand," he said finally, his voice still low, "that your presence here complicates matters. Your father, the Earl of Blackmere, is a powerful man. He will not take kindly to your defiance. And Ashworth, he is not a man to be trifled with." "I know," Beatrice said, her voice barely a whisper, "but I would rather face their wrath than then submit to that marriage." He looked at her again, his eyes searching. "You are brave, Lady Beatrice. Or perhaps foolish. I have not yet decided which." "Perhaps both," she admitted, a faint smile touching her lips. He returned the smile, a fleeting expression that softened his features, making him look younger, less burdened. It was a glimpse of the man he might have been, before the shadows had fallen, before the exile. "You remind me," he said, his voice tinged with a wistfulness she couldn't quite understand, "of someone I once knew. Someone who also defied expectations." He paused, his gaze drifting towards the window, towards the moonlit valley below. The silence stretched, filled with unspoken memories, with a sense of loss that hung heavy in the air. "My father will send men after me," Beatrice said, breaking the silence, bringing him back to the present. "Ashworth will demand my return." Sir Geoffrey nodded. "Undoubtedly. And I am bound by oath to offer sanctuary to those who seek it. But I am also bound by other oaths, older oaths, that limit my ability to intervene in the affairs of the kingdom." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. His words were cryptic, veiled in a meaning she couldn't quite grasp. What are you saying?" He turned back to her, his eyes filled with a gravity that made her heart sink. "I am saying, Lady Beatrice, that while you are under my roof, you are safe. But I cannot guarantee your safety beyond these walls. And I will not go to war with your father or with Ashworth on your behalf." It was not the answer she had hoped for, but it was an honest answer. And in this strange, forbidding place, honesty was perhaps the most valuable currency of all. She had come seeking a savior, a knight in shining armor. But she had found, instead, a man burdened by his own past, a man who offered not salvation, but a temporary reprieve, a sanctuary of stone, within which to weather their gathering storms. "I understand," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor of fear that ran through her. "I ask only for time." Time to think, time to plan, time to find my own way. He studied her for a moment longer, his expression unreadable. Time, he said finally, his voice a low murmur, is a precious commodity, Lady Beatrice. Especially here in the north. Especially now. A distant horn blew, echoing through the silent fortress. He stiffened, his face suddenly alert. Chapter 3. The Lord of Shadows. The horn's mournful call sliced through the quiet intimacy of the library, shattering the fragile truce that had settled between them. Sir Geoffrey's entire demeanor shifted, the weary lord replaced by a watchful, wary warrior. He moved with a sudden, unexpected grace, crossing the room to the narrow window and peering out into the darkness. "What is it?" Beatrice asked, rising from her chair, her heart pounding with a renewed sense of unease. He didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on something beyond her view. The muscles in his jaw were tense, his hand resting on the hilt of a sword that she hadn't noticed before, strapped to his side beneath his heavy furs. The firelight flickered across his face, highlighting the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the deep lines etched around his eyes, making him look even more like a figure carved from stone, a guardian of ancient secrets. "Scouts," he said finally, his voice curt. "On the northern ridge. Too many to be a simple patrol." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Her father's men? Ashworth? Had they found her already? So quickly?
Are they?
She couldn't bring herself to finish the question. He turned back to her, his expression grim.
"We don't know yet.
But we must be prepared." He glanced around the library, his gaze lingering on the shelves filled with books and scrolls. "This is no place for you, my lady. You will be safer in the inner chambers." He led her out of the library and back into the great hall, which was now a hive of activity. Men at arms were strapping on armor, checking weapons, their movements practiced and efficient. The women had disappeared, presumably to safer quarters within the fortress. The air was thick with tension, with the unspoken fear of what was to come. He guided her through a maze of corridors, the stone walls cold and damp beneath her fingertips. The sounds of the fortress, the clang of metal, the hurried footsteps, the muted voices echoed around them, amplifying the sense of urgency and impending danger. They reached a heavy, iron-bound door, guarded by two more silent sentinels. Sir Geoffrey exchanged a few words with them in a low voice, then turned back to Beatrice. "This is the women's wing," he explained. "You will be safe here. The chambers are well defended, and the women will look after you." He hesitated, his gaze searching hers. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a vulnerability that she hadn't seen before. "Concern? Regret? I will try to keep you informed," he said, his voice a little rough. "But I cannot make any promises. Events are unfolding." He opened the door, revealing a dimly lit corridor lined with more doors. The air was warmer here, scented with the faint aroma of herbs and beeswax. A woman emerged from one of the chambers, her face lined with worry, but her eyes calm and steady. She was dressed in a simple, dark gown, her gray hair pulled back in a tight bun. "This is Alara," Sir Geoffrey said, introducing her. "My housekeeper. She will see to your needs." Alara curtsied to Beatrice, her gaze assessing. "Welcome, Lady Beatrice. We have been expecting you." Again, that unsettling phrase. "Expecting you."
How? Why?
Sir Geoffrey gave Beatrice one last, lingering look, then turned and strode back down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silence. She watched him go, feeling a strange mix of fear and something else. A reluctant admiration? A grudging respect? She wasn't sure. Alara touched her arm gently. "Come, my lady. You must be tired. And hungry. We have prepared a chamber for you." Beatrice followed her down the corridor, her mind racing. She was safe, for now, within the walls of Moray. But she was also a prisoner, trapped by her circumstances, by the choices she had made. And the Lord of Moray, the Winter Lord, was not the savior she had imagined, but a complex, enigmatic figure, shrouded in shadows, burdened by his own secrets, his own loyalties. The chamber Alara led her to was small but comfortable, with a narrow bed, a chest for her belongings, and a small window that looked out onto an inner courtyard. A fire burned in a small hearth, casting a warm glow over the room. A simple meal of bread, cheese, and dried fruit had been laid out on a small table. "Eat," Alara said, gesturing towards the food. "You need your strength." Beatrice sat down at the table, but she had little appetite. Her thoughts were still racing, her mind filled with questions. "How did you know I was coming?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alara smiled, a knowing, enigmatic smile. "The Lord of Moray has his ways," she said, echoing the guard's earlier words. "He sees much from these walls. He hears the whispers on the wind." She paused, her gaze shifting to the window, to the darkness beyond. "He has been expecting trouble. For some time now. Your arrival, it is not unexpected." Beatrice felt a knot tighten in her stomach. "Trouble? What kind of trouble?" Alara hesitated, her gaze flickering back to Beatrice. "There are rumors," she said, her voice low, "of unrest in the north, of shifting alliances, of old grievances resurfacing." She paused again, her eyes filled with a deep, unspoken sadness. "The king, he is not well. And there are those who would take advantage of his weakness. Those who would seek to claim the throne for themselves." Beatrice stared at her, her mind reeling. This was more than just a personal feud, more than just a forced marriage. This was rebellion, treason. "And Sir Geoffrey?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Where does he stand in all of this?" Alara's expression was unreadable. "The Lord of Moray serves the crown," she said, her voice firm. "He always has. He always will." But there was a subtle emphasis on the has, a hint of past tense, that made Beatrice wonder. What had happened to Sir Geoffrey? What was the crime that had led to his exile? And what role would he play in the events that were now unfolding? She was safe, but she would not have peace within until the shadows lifted and revealed the truth. The distant howl of a wolf pierced the stillness. Chapter 4. Whispers in the Gallery. The wolf's howl lingered in the air, a primal sound that seemed to vibrate through the very stones of the fortress. It was a sound that spoke of wilderness, of danger, of the untamed forces that lay just beyond the walls of Moray. And it mirrored the unease that churned within Beatrice, a sense of being caught in a web of intrigue, of secrets and half-truths. Alara left her shortly after, promising to return with fresh water and warmer clothes. Beatrice ate a little of the food, more out of a sense of duty than any real hunger. She paced the small chamber, her mind restless, unable to settle. She tried to focus on practical matters, on what she would do if her father's men did indeed find her. But her thoughts kept returning to Sir Geoffrey, to the Lord of Shadows, as she had begun to think of him. What was his story? What had driven him to this remote, forbidding place? And what was his connection to the rumors of rebellion that Alara had hinted at? She found herself drawn to the window, gazing out at the inner courtyard. It was a small, enclosed space, surrounded by high stone walls. A few patches of snow lingered in the corners, reflecting the pale moonlight. The air was still and cold, the silence broken only by the occasional murmur of voices from within the fortress. She was about to turn away from the window when she saw a flicker of movement in one of the corridors that opened onto the courtyard. A figure, cloaked and hooded, slipped silently from one doorway to another, disappearing into the shadows. It was too quick, too furtive, to be a simple servant going about their duties. Beatrice's heart quickened.
Who was that?
And where were they going? Was it connected to the scouts on the northern ridge? To the rumors of unrest? She hesitated, her curiosity battling with her fear. She knew she should stay in her chamber, stay safe, as Sir Geoffrey had instructed. But the urge to know, to understand the forces that were swirling around her, was too strong to resist. She slipped out of her chamber and into the dimly lit corridor. The air was colder here, the silence deeper. She moved cautiously, her footsteps muffled by the thick rushes that covered the stone floor. She followed the corridor that led to the courtyard, her senses on high alert. She reached the doorway that opened onto the courtyard and peered out cautiously. The figure she had seen was gone, but as she scanned the courtyard, she noticed another doorway, on the opposite side, that stood slightly ajar. A faint light flickered from within, casting a long, narrow beam across the courtyard. She hesitated again, her heart pounding in her chest. This was reckless, foolish. She should turn back. But something, a gut feeling, a sense of impending danger, propelled her forward. She slipped across the courtyard, her footsteps silent on the frozen ground. She reached the doorway and peered inside. It was a long, narrow gallery, lined with portraits. The walls were hung with tapestries, their colors faded with age. The air was musty, scented with the faint aroma of dust and decay. The only light came from a single torch, burning low in a sconce on the wall, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to twist and writhe like living things. And at the far end of the gallery, two figures stood silhouetted against the flickering light. They were deep in conversation, their voices low and urgent. Beatrice couldn't see their faces, but she recognized one of the figures immediately. It was Sir Geoffrey. The other figure was smaller, slimmer, wearing a cloak that concealed their features. But from the way they held themselves, from the way their head was tilted, Beatrice guessed that it was a woman. She strained to hear their words, her heart pounding in her chest. She could only catch snippets of their conversation, fragments of sentences that made little sense. "I cannot risk it," Sir Geoffrey was saying, his voice low and intense. "That too dangerous. That must be sure." The woman replied, her voice equally urgent. "That the stakes are too high. That loyalty." Sir Geoffrey said, the word heavy with meaning. "That oath. That betrayal." The woman countered, her voice sharp. "That sacrifice." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Betrayal? Sacrifice? What were they talking about? Was it connected to her? To the rumors of rebellion? She leaned closer, trying to hear more, but the torch on the wall sputtered and died, plunging the gallery into darkness. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a cry. She heard a sudden movement, the rustle of cloth, the sound of footsteps approaching. She shrank back into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Who's there?" Sir Geoffrey's voice, sharp and commanding, echoed through the gallery. Beatrice held her breath, her body frozen with fear. She knew she had been discovered. She had stumbled into something she shouldn't have, something dangerous, something that could have dire consequences. The footsteps drew closer. She closed her eyes, bracing herself for the inevitable. She waited for the shout of alarm, the rough grip of a guard's hand on her arm. But it didn't come. Instead, she heard a soft, hesitant voice, a voice she recognized. "My lord? Is that you?" It was Alara. Beatrice let out a shaky breath, her body trembling with relief. But the relief was short-lived. She knew she couldn't stay hidden forever. She had to face Sir Geoffrey, face the consequences of her actions. She stepped out of the shadows, her head held high, her gaze meeting his. His eyes were like ice, piercing and unforgiving. The shadows were thick, and she couldn't read the expression in them. Chapter 5. A Tapestry of Secrets. The silence in the gallery was thick and heavy, punctuated only by the faint crackle of the dying embers in the distant hearth. Sir Geoffrey stood frozen, his gaze locked on Beatrice, his expression a mixture of surprise, anger, and something else, disappointment. Alara stood beside him, her face pale and worried. She glanced from Beatrice to Sir Geoffrey, her eyes filled with unspoken questions. "Lady Beatrice," Sir Geoffrey said finally, his voice low and controlled, but with an undercurrent of steel. "What are you doing here?" Beatrice swallowed, trying to moisten her dry throat. I saw someone," she stammered. "In the courtyard." "I followed them," she trailed off, realizing how lame her explanation sounded. She knew she had been caught snooping, intruding on something that was clearly none of her business. Sir Geoffrey's eyes narrowed. "You saw someone? Who?" I don't know," she admitted. "It was dark. They were cloaked and hooded. I couldn't see their face." He studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. He was trying to determine if she was lying, if she was hiding something. "And you followed them here?" he asked, his voice still low, but with a hint of disbelief. Yes, Beatrice said, her voice a little stronger now. I was curious.
I wanted to know what was going on.
He let out a short, sharp breath, a sound that was almost a sigh. Curiosity, he said, his voice tinged with irony, can be a dangerous thing, Lady Beatrice. Especially in a place like this. He turned to Alara. Take Lady Beatrice back to her chamber, he instructed. And see that she stays there. Alara nodded, her face still pale and worried. She took Beatrice's arm gently. Come, my lady, she said. It is late. You need to rest. Beatrice allowed herself to be led away, her gaze lingering on Sir Geoffrey. He didn't look at her, his attention already shifting back to the darkness, to the secrets that the gallery held. As Alara led her back through the corridors, Beatrice couldn't shake the feeling that she had stumbled into something far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. The whispered conversation, the cloaked figure, the rumors of rebellion, it all pointed to a web of intrigue that stretched far beyond the walls of Moray, to the very heart of the kingdom. Back in her chamber, Alara lit a fresh candle, the flame casting a warm glow over the small room. She brought Beatrice a cup of warm milk, laced with honey and herbs, a traditional remedy for calming frayed nerves. Drink this, my lady, she said softly. It will help you sleep. Beatrice took the cup, her hands still trembling slightly. She sat down on the edge of the bed, her mind racing. Alara, she said, her voice low and hesitant. Who was that woman? The one Sir Geoffrey was talking to in the gallery? Alara hesitated, her gaze flickering to the door, as if checking to see if anyone was listening. I cannot say, my lady, she said, her voice barely a whisper. It is not my place. But you know, don't you? Beatrice persisted. You know what's going on. You know what they were talking about. Alara sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly. There are many secrets in Moray, Lady Beatrice, she said, her voice filled with a deep sadness. Secrets that are best left undisturbed. But I'm involved now, aren't I? Beatrice said, her voice rising slightly. By coming here, by seeking sanctuary, I've become a part of this web of intrigue. Alara looked at her, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and concern. Yes, my lady, she said softly. You are. She paused, then added, her voice barely audible, and I fear for you. For what may happen? Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. Alara's words confirmed her worst fears. She was not just a refugee, a pawn in a game of power. She was a player, whether she wanted to be or not. Tell me, Beatrice pleaded, her voice desperate. Tell me what you know. I need to understand. I need to be prepared. Alara hesitated again, her gaze flickering back to the door. She seemed to be wrestling with her conscience, with her loyalty to Sir Geoffrey, and with a growing sense of concern for Beatrice. Finally, she took a deep breath and spoke, her voice low and urgent. The tapestries, she said. In the gallery. They tell a story. A story of the Moray family. Of their history. Of their downfall. Beatrice frowned. Tapestries? What do they have to do with anything? They depict the events, Alara explained, that led to Sir Geoffrey's exile. The crime he was accused of. She paused, her voice dropping to a whisper. They say he betrayed the king. That he plotted to overthrow him. Beatrice stared at her, her mind reeling. Sir Geoffrey? A traitor? It seemed impossible. He was a man of honor, a man of duty. Or so she had believed. But that's not true, is it? She asked, her voice trembling. He wouldn't do that. Alara's expression was unreadable. I do not know, my lady, she said softly. I only know what the tapestries show. And what the rumors say. She stood, ready to leave Beatrice to the shadows of the room. And now, he is warning me, it is the same tune played once more. Only this time it is not him at the center. Chapter 6. The Price of Protection. Alara's words echoed in Beatrice's mind long after the housekeeper had left, stirring a disquiet that sleep couldn't banish. The tapestry is a hidden history woven into faded threads, a story of betrayal and exile. And Geoffrey, the Winter Lord, at the center of it all. Was he truly a traitor, as the rumors claimed? Or was he a victim of circumstance, a pawn in a larger game? The candle burned low, casting long, dancing shadows on the walls of the chamber. Beatrice lay in bed, her eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. She tried to piece together the fragments of information she had gathered, the whispered conversations, the cloaked figures, the rumors of rebellion. But it was like trying to assemble a shattered mirror. The pieces didn't quite fit, and the reflection was distorted, unclear. She rose from the bed, unable to remain still. She paced the small chamber, her mind racing. She needed answers. She needed to understand the truth. And she knew that the only way to find it was to confront Sir Geoffrey directly. She waited until dawn, until the first faint light began to filter through the narrow window. Then, she dressed quickly, pulling on the warmer clothes that Alara had brought her. She slipped out of her chamber and made her way back to the great hall. The hall was quiet, the remnants of the previous night's activity cleared away. A few servants were moving about, preparing for the day ahead. Beatrice saw a young stable boy, and she placed the request for her horse to be prepared, and to meet her at the less-used western gate. Then she searched. The fortress was a maze of corridors and chambers, and she had little sense of direction. But she persisted, driven by a growing sense of urgency. Finally, she found him. He was in the armory, a large, cavernous chamber filled with weapons of all kinds: swords, spears, axes, bows, arrows. He was standing before a rack of swords, examining one of them closely, his back to her. He was dressed in a simple tunic and breeches, his dark hair still damp from a recent wash. He looked younger in the morning light, less imposing, but still with that aura of power and authority that surrounded him. Beatrice took a deep breath and stepped into the armory. "Sir Geoffrey," she said, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. He turned, his expression surprised. He hadn't heard her approach. He studied her for a moment, his eyes taking in her determined expression, the way she held herself, her chin lifted, her gaze meeting his directly. "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice neutral. "You are up early." "I need to talk to you," she said, her voice firm. "About last night. About the tapestries. About everything." He hesitated, his gaze flickering to the sword in his hand, then back to her. He seemed to be weighing his options, deciding how much to reveal, how much to conceal. "Very well," he said finally, his voice resigned. "But not here.
Come with me."
He led her out of the armory and through another series of corridors until they reached a small, secluded garden, tucked away behind the fortress walls. It was a surprising oasis of calm amidst the stark, unforgiving landscape. A few hardy plants still clung to life, their leaves covered in a thin layer of frost. A stone bench sat beneath a gnarled old tree, offering a view of the valley below. He gestured towards the bench. "Sit," he said. She sat down, her gaze fixed on him. He remained standing, leaning against the tree, his arms crossed over his chest. "You were eavesdropping last night," he said, his voice direct, accusing. "Yes," Beatrice admitted, her chin lifting. "I was. And I heard things. Things that concern me. Things that I need to understand." He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "I told you," he said, his voice weary, "that curiosity can be a dangerous thing. But I'm already in danger, aren't I?" Beatrice countered. "By coming here, by seeking your protection, I've placed myself in the middle of whatever is happening." He looked at her, his eyes searching. "You understand the price of that protection, Lady Beatrice?" he asked, his voice low and serious. "My protection comes with conditions." "Conditions?" Beatrice frowned. "What kind of conditions?" He hesitated, his gaze shifting to the valley below, to the distant mountains that rose like jagged teeth against the pale morning sky. "My loyalty," he said finally, his voice barely a whisper, "is to the crown, to the king. Even if the king is weak, even if there are those who would seek to usurp his power." Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now. He was warning her. He was telling her that his protection would not extend to sheltering a rebel, a traitor, even if that traitor was her. "And if my father, if Ashworth, if they come here, demanding my return?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep sadness. "I will offer you what protection I can," he said, his voice firm. "Within these walls, you are safe. But I will not defy the king's authority. If he orders your return, I will have no choice but to comply." It was not the oath that worried him, she realized. It was what defiance of that oath might mean. Beatrice felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had known this deep down. She had known that Sir Geoffrey's protection was not absolute, that it came with limitations. But hearing it spoken aloud, hearing the cold, hard truth of it, was like a blow to the chest. She stood and went to the wall. "There is more, isn't there?" she said, finally looking down into the valley below. "Much more that you are not saying." He came to stand beside her, the silence pulling tight. "Yes," he answered, finally. "Much more." He stared forward, his eyes distant, and waited. Chapter 7. Beneath a Frozen Moon. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words, with the weight of secrets yet to be revealed. Beatrice looked out at the valley, at the vast, unforgiving landscape that stretched before them. The sun was rising, casting a golden glow on the snow-capped peaks, but the shadows still lingered in the valleys, clinging to the darkness. "Tell me," she said finally, her voice low and steady.
Tell me everything.
"I deserve to know the truth." Sir Geoffrey sighed, his breath misting in the cold air. He turned to her, his eyes filled with a weariness that seemed to go beyond the present moment, reaching back into the depths of his past. "The tapestries," he said, his voice a low murmur. "Alara was right. They tell a story. My family story. A story of loyalty and betrayal and loss." He paused, his gaze drifting back to the valley, his expression distant, as if he were seeing something beyond the physical landscape, something that existed only in his memory. "My father," he began, his voice tinged with a mixture of respect and regret, "was a loyal servant of the crown. He fought in the Southern Wars alongside the king. He was a hero, a legend, and he instilled in me that same sense of duty, that same unwavering loyalty." He paused again, his jaw tightening. But there were others. Others who did not share his loyalty. Others who saw the king as weak, as unfit to rule. Others who plotted to overthrow him. Beatrice listened intently, her heart pounding in her chest. She could sense the pain in his voice, the weight of the past that he carried. "And my father, he discovered their plot," Sir Geoffrey continued, his voice barely a whisper. "He uncovered their treachery, and he reported it to the king." He turned to her, his eyes filled with a deep, searing pain. "But the king, he did not believe him. He accused my father of lying, of trying to sow discord, of seeking to advance his own position." Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. But that's not possible. Why would he do that?" Sir Geoffrey shook his head, his expression bitter. "Because he was surrounded by flatterers, by sycophants, by those who whispered poison in his ear. Because he was weak, and because he trusted the wrong people." He paused, his gaze shifting back to the valley, his voice dropping to a whisper. "And so my father was accused of treason. He was stripped of his lands, his titles, his honor. He was executed." Beatrice stared at him, her eyes wide with horror. "Executed? But he was innocent." Sir Geoffrey nodded, his eyes filled with a grief that seemed to have no end. "Yes," he said softly. "He was innocent. But innocence is not always enough." He turned to her, his gaze intense. "And I was exiled, banished to this remote fortress, to live out my days in shame, a reminder of my father's failure." Beatrice felt tears welling up in her eyes. She could barely imagine the pain he must have endured, the injustice, the loss. But you didn't betray the king," she said, her voice trembling. "You remained loyal, despite everything." He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "Yes," he said.
I did.
"I kept my oath, even though it cost me everything." He paused, his gaze shifting to the sky, to the pale moon that still lingered in the morning sky, a ghostly reminder of the night that had passed. And now, he continued, his voice low and serious, history is repeating itself. There are rumors of another plot, another rebellion. And I am caught in the middle once again. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine. She understood now. The whispered conversations, the cloaked figures, the scouts on the northern ridge, it was all connected. And she, by seeking sanctuary at Moray, had placed herself in the center of this gathering storm. He turned back to her. I am doing all that I can, he explained, a muscle working in his jaw. There is a plot afoot, yes, but it goes deeper than mere whispers in a darkened gallery. Lord Ashworth is involved. The color drained from her face. Ashworth? He nodded. The king grows weaker, and the vultures circle. Your betrothal was more than a whim of the throne, Beatrice. It was a strategic move. Ashworth seeks to unite the northern houses against the crown. Your father was not powerless to stop the marriage. He was complicit. Beatrice stumbled back, barely registering the cold stone of the wall as it met her back. My father? He looked at her, his gaze not unkind, but unwavering.
Yes.
The Earl of Blackmere walks a dangerous line. He has made promises, and now he finds himself caught. But that is not my concern. My concern is you, and this fortress, and preventing war, not starting one. Now I must ride out. There is a meeting I must attend. Of those still loyal. Beatrice stared at him, numb. She was suddenly, devastatingly alone. He turned to leave, pausing at the archway leading from the garden, his silhouette framed against the brightening sky. Stay within the walls, Lady Beatrice, he said, his voice echoing the warning he had given her upon her arrival. Only now, the words carried a far greater weight. For your own safety, and pray that I return. Then he was gone. Chapter 8. The Hunter and the Hunted. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Her father, a traitor? Ashworth, the architect of a rebellion? The foundations upon which Beatrice had built her life, her understanding of loyalty and family, crumbled beneath her feet, leaving her adrift in a sea of uncertainty and fear. Geoffrey's departure left a void in the fortress, a palpable absence that amplified her isolation. She remained in the garden for a long time, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, chasing away the last vestiges of night. But the warmth of the sun did little to dispel the chill that had settled deep within her bones. She felt like a trapped bird, caught in a cage of stone, with no escape in sight. Eventually, she forced herself to move, to return to the fortress. She had to think, to plan, to find a way out of this impossible situation. She couldn't simply wait for Geoffrey's return, for the inevitable arrival of her father's men, or worse, Ashworth himself. She had to take control of her own destiny. She returned to her chamber, her mind racing. She needed information, allies, a way to escape Moray, to disappear before it was too late. But who could she trust? Alara, despite her kindness, was loyal to Geoffrey, bound by her own secrets and obligations. The other inhabitants of the fortress were strangers, their allegiances unknown. She paced the small chamber, her gaze drawn to the chest that contained her belongings. She had brought so little with her, only the bare necessities for her flight from Blackmere. But as she rummaged through the contents, her fingers brushed against something hard, something hidden beneath a layer of folded cloth. She pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound book, a diary that she had kept since she was a child. She had almost forgotten about it, had packed it in a moment of sentimentality, thinking she might never see her home again. She opened the book, her fingers tracing the faded ink on the yellowed pages. The entries were filled with the mundane details of her life at Blackmere, the balls, the hunts, the lessons, the gossip of the court. But as she flipped through the pages, she stumbled upon an entry from several months ago, a passage that made her heart skip a beat. It was a description of a secret passage, a hidden tunnel that led from the cellars of Blackmere to a nearby forest. She had discovered it as a child, while playing hide and seek with her cousins. She had never told anyone about it, had kept it as her own secret, a place of refuge and escape. A flicker of hope ignited within her. If there was a secret passage at Blackmere, perhaps there was one at Moray as well. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance she had. She closed the diary, her mind made up. She would search for a secret passage, a way out of the fortress. She would not wait for rescue, for fate to decide her future. She would take her destiny into her own hands. She spent the rest of the day exploring the fortress, moving cautiously, trying to avoid attracting attention. She started with the cellars, the darkest, most neglected part of the fortress, where she imagined a secret passage might be hidden. The cellars were a labyrinth of damp, narrow corridors, lined with barrels and crates, filled with the musty smell of aging wine and forgotten stores. The air was thick and heavy, the silence broken only by the occasional drip of water and the scuttling of rats. She searched for hours, her fingers tracing the cold, damp stone walls, looking for any sign of a hidden door, a loose stone, anything that might betray the existence of a secret passage. But she found nothing. As dusk began to fall, she was about to give up, her hope dwindling. She had explored every corner of the cellars, every corridor, every chamber, and had found nothing. She was exhausted, discouraged, and increasingly fearful. She was about to return to her chamber when she noticed something she had missed before. In the furthest corner of the cellars, hidden behind a stack of empty barrels, there was a small, arched doorway, almost completely obscured by shadows. Her heart quickened. She approached the doorway cautiously, her senses on high alert. She pushed aside the barrels, revealing the doorway in its entirety. It was made of heavy oak, reinforced with iron bands, and it was locked. But as she examined the lock more closely, she noticed something peculiar. It was old, rusted, and it looked as if it hadn't been used in years. And there was a small gap, a tiny space between the lock and the doorframe. She remembered a trick she had learned as a child, a way to open a locked door using a thin piece of metal. She pulled a hairpin from her hair, her fingers trembling slightly. She carefully inserted the hairpin into the gap, wiggling it gently, trying to manipulate the lock. It took several attempts, her hands sweating, her heart pounding in her chest. But finally, she felt a click, a subtle shift in the mechanism. She pulled on the door, and it swung open, revealing a dark, narrow passage beyond. Beatrice stood there for a moment, her breath caught in her throat. She had found it.
Un secret passage.
A way out. But where did it lead? And was she brave enough to venture into the unknown, to risk the dangers that might lie ahead? The fortress seemed to hold its breath with her. Chapter 9. Scars of the Past. The passage was dark, damp, and claustrophobic. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and earth, and the silence was absolute, broken only by the faint drip of water and the pounding of Beatrice's own heart. She hesitated at the threshold, her fear battling with her determination. This was madness, reckless folly. She could get lost, trapped, or worse. But the alternative waiting for Geoffrey's return, for the arrival of her father's men, for the inevitable confrontation was even more terrifying. She had to take this chance, this desperate gamble. She had to escape. She took a deep breath and stepped into the passage. The door swung shut behind her, plunging her into absolute darkness. She fumbled for the tinderbox she had taken from her room, her hands trembling. She struck the flint, and a spark ignited the tinder, casting a flickering, fragile light. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for her to walk through. The walls were made of rough-hewn stone, damp and slimy to the touch. The floor was uneven, littered with rubble and debris. She moved cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate, her hand holding the tinderbox aloft, casting a small circle of light that barely penetrated the darkness. The passage seemed to go on forever, twisting and turning, descending deeper and deeper into the earth. She had no idea where it led, how far it went, or what dangers might lie ahead. But she pressed on, driven by a primal instinct for survival, by the desperate hope of finding freedom. As she walked, she began to notice markings on the walls, faint scratches and carvings that were almost invisible in the dim light. She stopped to examine them more closely, holding the tinderbox closer to the wall. They were symbols, ancient runes, and crude drawings. Some of them were familiar, symbols of protection, of warding off evil. Others were more obscure, their meaning unknown. And some were disturbing. Images of beasts, of demons, of grotesque figures that seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light. Beatrice felt a shiver run down her spine. These were not the markings of ordinary people. These were the symbols of a darker, more ancient world, a world of magic and superstition, of forces beyond human comprehension. She pressed on, her fear growing with every step. She began to hear sounds, faint whispers and murmurs that seemed to come from the walls themselves. She couldn't make out the words, but they sounded like voices, chanting, whispering, moaning. She told herself it was just the wind, the echo of water dripping, her own imagination playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew it was something more. Something sinister. She rounded a corner and stopped dead in her tracks. The passage opened into a large chamber, a cavernous space that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. And in the center of the chamber, there was a figure. It was standing motionless, silhouetted against the faint glow of the tinderbox. It was tall and gaunt, wrapped in what looked like rags or animal skins. Its head was covered by a hood, obscuring its face. But Beatrice could sense its presence, its power, a palpable aura of darkness and menace. She froze, her body paralyzed with fear. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. She was trapped, caught in the gaze of this creature. The figure slowly raised its head, and Beatrice saw its eyes. They were glowing, burning with an unholy light, a light that seemed to pierce her very soul.
Who are you?
She stammered, her voice barely a whisper. The figure didn't answer. It simply stood there, watching her, its eyes burning into hers. Then it slowly raised its hand, and Beatrice saw that it was holding something. It was a knife, a long, curved blade that gleamed wickedly in the dim light. And it was stained with something dark, something that looked like blood. The figure took a step towards her, its movements slow and deliberate, like a predator stalking its prey. Beatrice finally found her voice, a scream tearing from her throat. She turned and ran, blindly, desperately, back the way she had come. She didn't look back, didn't dare to see if the figure was following her. She just ran, her heart pounding, her lungs burning, her mind filled with terror. She stumbled, fell, scrambled to her feet, and ran again. She didn't know how long she ran, how far she went. She just knew that she had to escape, to get away from that thing. Finally, she saw a faint light ahead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She ran towards it, her legs aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst out of the passage and into the library. The same library where she had first spoken to Geoffrey, where she had revealed her secrets, her fears. She was back where she started. But before she could register anything else, she was grabbed. Strong arms wrapped around her, not in kindness, but in anger. "Where have you been?" Geoffrey roared, shaking her. His face was a mask of fury, his eyes blazing. But beneath the anger, Beatrice saw something else. Relief. And fear? The tinderbox lay on the stone floor, the flame extinguished. Chapter 10. A Dance of Deception. The force of Geoffrey's grip was bruising, his anger a palpable force that washed over Beatrice, momentarily eclipsing the terror she had experienced in the hidden passage. She struggled against him, not out of defiance, but out of sheer panic, her mind still reeling from the encounter with the hooded figure, the blood-stained knife. "Let me go," she gasped, her voice trembling. There's something down there, a creature." His grip tightened, his eyes searching hers, trying to decipher the truth behind her frantic words.
"What are you talking about?"
"What creature? Where have you been?" She tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a jumbled rush, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She told him about the secret passage, the markings on the walls, the chamber, the hooded figure, the knife. He listened, his expression shifting from anger to disbelief, then to a dawning horror. He released her abruptly, his hands falling to his sides. "Show me," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Show me where." He retrieved the tinderbox, relighting it with a practiced hand. Then, without a word, he followed her back into the corridor, back towards the cellars, back towards the darkness. She led him to the hidden doorway, pushing aside the barrels that concealed it. She hesitated at the threshold, her fear returning, her body trembling. "Are you sure about this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It's dangerous down there." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a strange mixture of determination and something else. Was it fear? Or something darker? Something hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed composure? "I have to see it," he said, his voice firm. "I have to know what's down there." He stepped into the passage, and Beatrice, despite her terror, followed him. The darkness closed in around them, the silence broken only by the faint drip of water and the pounding of their hearts. They walked in silence, Geoffrey leading the way, his hand holding the tinderbox aloft, casting a small circle of light that barely penetrated the darkness. Beatrice stayed close behind him, her gaze darting nervously from side to side, expecting the hooded figure to appear at any moment. They reached the chamber, the cavernous space that had terrified her before. Geoffrey held the tinderbox high, his gaze sweeping the room, searching for any sign of the figure. But it was gone. The chamber was empty, silent. The only evidence of her encounter, the faint markings on the walls, the lingering scent of something foul, something that made her stomach churn. Geoffrey lowered the tinderbox, his expression grim. "There's nothing here," he said, his voice a low murmur. "You must have imagined it."
"No,"
Beatrice protested, her voice rising. "I saw it. I saw the figure. The knife, the blood." He looked at her, his eyes filled with doubt. "Beatrice," he said softly, "you've been through a lot. You're exhausted, stressed. It's understandable that you might hallucinate." "I'm not hallucinating," she insisted, her voice trembling with frustration. "I know what I saw." He sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Very well," he said, his voice resigned. "Let's get out of here." He turned to leave, and Beatrice, defeated and confused, followed him. She knew what she had seen, but she also knew that she couldn't prove it. She had no evidence, no witnesses, only her own word against his doubt. As they walked back through the passage, Geoffrey stopped suddenly, his hand reaching out to touch the wall. He examined the markings more closely, his brow furrowed in thought. "These symbols," he said, his voice low and thoughtful. "They're familiar. I've seen them before." "Where?" Beatrice asked, her heart quickening with hope. Perhaps he did believe her after all. He shook his head, his expression troubled. "I can't quite place it," he said. "But there's something unsettling about them." They continued walking, reaching the library, without further incident. Geoffrey closed and locked the hidden doorway, concealing it once again behind the stack of barrels. He turned to Beatrice, his expression serious. "Don't go down there again," he said, his voice firm. "It's not safe. Whatever you saw, or thought you saw, it's best left undisturbed." But Beatrice began to protest, but he cut her off. "No buts," he said, his voice brooking no argument. "Promise me you won't go down there again." She hesitated, her desire to uncover the truth battling with her fear, with her growing sense of unease. But she also knew that she couldn't defy him, not now, not when she was so vulnerable, so dependent on his protection. "I promise," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. He nodded, his expression softening slightly.
"Good," he said.
"Now, get some rest. You need it." He left her then, disappearing back into the maze of corridors, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her fears, her doubts. She returned to her chamber, but she couldn't sleep. Her mind was racing, replaying the events of the night, the encounter in the passage, Geoffrey's reaction, the mystery of the symbols. She realized that she had been so focused on escaping Moray, on finding a way out, that she had overlooked something important. She had been so consumed by her own fears that she had failed to see the bigger picture, the web of intrigue that surrounded her, the forces that were at play. The deception ran much deeper. Her being here was only one piece of the puzzle. She lay in bed and, staring up at the stone ceiling, finally saw the dance. Chapter 11. The Serpent's Kiss. The following days passed in a blur of unease and apprehension. Beatrice kept her promise to Geoffrey, avoiding the cellars and the hidden passage. But she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that she was surrounded by secrets, by forces she didn't understand. She spent much of her time in the library, poring over the books and scrolls, hoping to find some clue, some explanation for the events that were unfolding around her. She searched for information about the Moray family, about the symbols she had seen in the passage, about the rumors of rebellion. But the library yielded little in the way of concrete answers. The books were old, their pages brittle and faded, their language archaic and obscure. The scrolls were filled with genealogies, treaties, and legal documents, none of which seemed relevant to her situation. She did, however, stumble upon a few passages that hinted at a darker history, a history of magic and superstition, of ancient rituals and forbidden knowledge. She read about the old gods, the pagan deities that had been worshipped in the north before the arrival of Christianity, about the sacrifices and offerings that had been made to appease them. She also found references to a secret society, a clandestine group known as the Order of the Serpent, who were said to practice dark magic, to worship the old gods, to seek to overthrow the established order. Beatrice felt a chill run down her spine as she read these passages. Could the symbols she had seen in the passage be connected to this Order of the Serpent? Could the hooded figures she had encountered be one of their members? She was about to delve deeper into these texts when she was interrupted by Alara, who entered the library with a message. "Lady Beatrice," she said, her voice low and urgent. "Sir Geoffrey requests your presence in the Great Hall. He has news." Beatrice's heart quickened. What news? Had her father's men arrived? Had Ashworth discovered her whereabouts? She followed Alara to the Great Hall, her mind racing with possibilities. The hall was filled with people, the usual inhabitants of the fortress, as well as several unfamiliar faces. There were men at arms, clad in armor, their faces grim and determined. There were nobles, dressed in fine clothes, their expressions anxious and uncertain. And at the head of the hall, standing before the fireplace, was Sir Geoffrey. He was dressed in full armor, his sword at his side, his expression grave. He looked like a warrior king, ready for battle. As Beatrice approached, he turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, a mixture of concern and something else. Was it regret? Or apology? "Lady Beatrice," he said, his voice formal, his tone betraying nothing. "I have received word from your father." Beatrice felt a knot tighten in her stomach. This was it. The moment she had been dreading. "He knows you are here," Sir Geoffrey continued. "And he demands your return." Beatrice swallowed, trying to moisten her dry throat. And what did you tell him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Sir Geoffrey hesitated, his gaze shifting to the assembled nobles, then back to her. "I told him," he said, his voice low and even, "that I would comply with his request." Beatrice felt the blood drain from her face. She had expected this, had known that Geoffrey was bound by his oath to the king, that he could not defy her father's authority. But hearing the words spoken aloud, hearing her fate sealed, was like a blow to the chest. She looked around the hall, at the faces of the assembled guests, searching for some sign of support, of sympathy. But she found none. They were all watching her, their expressions unreadable, their eyes filled with a mixture of curiosity and pity. She turned back to Geoffrey, her chin lifting, her gaze meeting his directly. "So," she said, her voice surprisingly steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "You are sending me back. Back to Ashworth. Back to a forced marriage. Back to a life of misery." He didn't answer immediately, his gaze holding hers. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of pain? Or was it guilt? "I have no choice," he said finally, his voice low and strained. "I am bound by my oath." "But there is always a choice," Beatrice countered, her voice rising slightly. "You could defy him.
You could protect me."
You could," she trailed off, realizing the futility of her words. She was asking him to betray his honor, his duty, his loyalty. She was asking him to risk everything for her, a woman he barely knew, a woman who had brought nothing but trouble into his life. He shook his head, his expression sad, resigned. "I cannot," he said softly. "I will not." He paused, then added, his voice barely audible, "But I will not send you back alone. I will accompany you. I will ensure your safety, as far as I am able." It was a small concession, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. But it was not enough. Beatrice knew that once she was back in her father's custody, once she was in Ashwyth's grasp, Geoffrey would be powerless to protect her. She turned away from him, her gaze sweeping the hall, her eyes filled with tears. She felt betrayed, abandoned, utterly alone. And then she saw him, standing in the shadows at the back of the hall, a figure she had not noticed before. He was tall and slender, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by a hood. But she recognized him instantly. It was the same figure she had seen in the secret passage, the hooded figure with the blood-stained knife. He was watching her, and a small, mocking smile played on his lips. Chapter 12. Beyond the Walls. Beatrice's blood ran cold. The hooded figure, here, in the great hall, amidst the nobles and men-at-arms. How had he gotten in? What was he doing here? The sight of him, the mocking smile, shattered the fragile composure she had managed to maintain. It was a blatant confirmation of the danger she was in, a danger that went far beyond her forced marriage, beyond the political machinations of the kingdom. She tried to speak, to warn Geoffrey, to point out the figure, but her voice caught in her throat. She could only stare, her eyes wide with terror, her body trembling. Geoffrey, noticing her distress, followed her gaze, his eyes scanning the crowd. But the figure had vanished, melting back into the shadows, disappearing as quickly and silently as he had appeared. "What is it?" Geoffrey asked, his voice concerned. "What's wrong?" Beatrice shook her head, unable to speak, unable to explain. She knew he wouldn't believe her, not without proof. He would dismiss it as another hallucination, another figment of her stressed imagination. The moment passed, and the hall resumed its uneasy stillness, the focus shifting back to the impending journey, to Beatrice's return to Blackmere. Geoffrey outlined the arrangements, his voice calm and authoritative, despite the undercurrent of tension that permeated the room. A small escort would accompany them, a handful of his most trusted men. They would leave at dawn, taking the mountain passes, hoping to avoid any encounters with Ashworth's forces, who were surely patrolling the main roads. Beatrice listened, her mind numb, her body heavy with dread. She felt like a lamb being led to the slaughter, powerless to resist her fate. She had tried to escape, to forge her own destiny, but she had failed. She was trapped, caught in a web of intrigue and betrayal, with no way out. As Geoffrey continued to speak, Beatrice's gaze drifted to the spot where the hooded figure had stood. He was gone, but she could still feel his presence, his eyes watching her, his mocking smile haunting her thoughts. She knew then that she couldn't go back to Blackmere, not with Geoffrey, not with the escort. She couldn't trust anyone, not anymore. She had to escape, on her own, to find a way to disappear, to protect herself from the forces that were closing in around her. The secret passage. It was her only hope. She had promised Geoffrey she wouldn't go down there again, but she had no choice. She had to risk it, to brave the darkness, the unknown, the terrors that might lie within. She waited until nightfall, until the fortress was quiet, the inhabitants asleep. She slipped out of her chamber, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way to the cellars, her senses on high alert, expecting the hooded figure to appear at any moment. She found the hidden doorway, pushing aside the barrels that concealed it. She hesitated at the threshold, her fear battling with her determination. This was madness, reckless folly. But she had no other option. She took a deep breath and stepped into the passage. The door swung shut behind her, plunging her into absolute darkness. She fumbled for the tinderbox she had brought with her, her hands trembling. She struck the flint, and a spark ignited the tinder, casting a flickering, fragile light. She moved cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate, her hand holding the tinderbox aloft. The passage was just as she remembered it, narrow, damp, and claustrophobic. The markings on the walls seemed to writhe and twist in the flickering light, their sinister presence amplified by the silence, by her fear. She reached the chamber, the cavernous space where she had encountered the hooded figure. She held the tinderbox high, her gaze sweeping the room, searching for any sign of him. But it was empty, silent. The only evidence of his presence the lingering scent of decay, of something foul and unholy. She continued on, following the passage as it twisted and turned, descending deeper and deeper into the earth. She had no idea where it led, how far it went, or what dangers might lie ahead. But she pressed on, driven by a desperate hope, by the instinct for survival. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, she saw a faint light ahead, a glimmer of hope in the darkness. She ran towards it, her legs aching, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She burst out of the passage and into the forest. The cold night air hit her face, and for the first time in days, she took a full, deep breath. She was outside the walls of Moray, free from the confines of the fortress, from the watchful eyes of Geoffrey, from the lurking presence of the hooded figure. But she was also alone, in the wilderness, with no protection, no supplies, no idea where to go. The forest was dark and menacing, the trees towering above her like silent giants, their branches intertwined, blocking out the moonlight. She had no idea what she was doing. But at least, for now, she was free. Chapter 13. Echoes of Allegiance. The forest was a tapestry of shadows and whispers, the cold night air biting at Beatrice's exposed skin. She had escaped the immediate confines of Moray, but she was far from safe. The wilderness held its own dangers, both natural and supernatural, and she was ill-equipped to face them. She had no food, no water, no weapons, only the thin cloak she wore and the flickering light of the tinderbox. She didn't know where she was, which direction to go, or how far she was from civilization. She was utterly, terrifyingly alone. She started walking, choosing a direction at random, hoping to find some sign of a path, a road, anything that might lead her to safety. The forest floor was uneven, covered in roots and fallen branches, making it difficult to navigate. The trees were dense, their branches intertwined, blocking out the moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe around her. She kept the tinderbox lit, its fragile flame her only source of comfort, her only protection against the darkness. But she knew it wouldn't last forever. The tinder was dwindling, and once it was gone, she would be plunged into absolute blackness. As she walked, she listened intently, her senses on high alert. She heard the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the snap of a twig, each sound amplified by the silence, by her fear. She imagined wild animals lurking in the shadows, their eyes watching her, waiting for an opportunity to strike. She also couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed, that the hooded figure was still out there, somewhere in the darkness, tracking her, stalking her. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see him emerge from the shadows, his blood-stained knife gleaming in the moonlight. But she saw nothing. Only the trees, the darkness, the shadows. After what seemed like hours, she stumbled upon a narrow path, a faint trail that wound its way through the trees. It was overgrown, barely visible, but it was a sign of civilization, a glimmer of hope. She followed the path, her pace quickening, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She didn't know where it led, but it was better than wandering aimlessly through the forest. The path led her uphill, gradually ascending towards a ridge. As she climbed, the trees began to thin, and she caught glimpses of the moonlit sky, of the vast, star-studded expanse above. She reached the ridge and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Before her, spread out like a tapestry, was a breathtaking view of the valley below. She could see the lights of a small village, nestled in the foothills of the mountains, a beacon of hope in the darkness. But she also saw something else. Further in the distance, on the opposite side of the valley, she saw the flickering lights of torches, the movement of figures, the unmistakable signs of a large encampment. It was an army. And from the banners that flew above the tents, from the colors that adorned the armor of the soldiers, she recognized them immediately. It was Ashworth's army. He had found her. Or, at least, he had found Moray. Beatrice felt a surge of despair. She had escaped the fortress, only to find herself caught between the wilderness and a hostile army. She was trapped, with nowhere to go, no one to turn to. She sank to the ground, her body trembling, her mind numb. She had failed. She had tried to escape, to forge her own destiny, but she had failed. She was doomed to return to Blackmere, to marry Ashworth, to live out her days as his prisoner. As she sat there, lost in her despair, she heard a sound, a faint rustle in the undergrowth behind her. She turned, her heart pounding, expecting to see the hooded figure, or perhaps one of Ashworth's soldiers. But it was neither. It was a horse, a magnificent black stallion, its coat gleaming in the moonlight. And on its back, riding towards her, was a familiar figure. It was Geoffrey. He was dressed in his armor, his sword at his side, his expression grim, determined. He looked like a warrior king, a figure from a legend, a beacon of hope in the darkness. He reined in his horse beside her, his gaze searching hers. "Beatrice," he said, his voice low and urgent. "What are you doing here? I told you to stay within the walls." She stared at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You followed me?" she stammered. He nodded, his expression softening slightly. "I knew you would try to escape," he said. "I knew you wouldn't go back to Blackmere willingly." He dismounted, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the heavy armor he wore. He stood before her, his gaze intense, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Was it admiration? Or respect? "I couldn't let you go alone," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "I couldn't let you face this danger on your own." He paused, then added, his voice filled with a deep, unspoken emotion. "I made a promise. To protect you. And I intend to keep it. Even if it means defying my oath." He looked towards Ashworth's camp, his hand going to his sword. "Even if it means war." Chapter 14. The Unveiling. Geoffrey's words hung in the air, a declaration of defiance, of loyalty, of a love that had blossomed in the most unlikely of circumstances. Beatrice stared at him, her heart swelling with a mixture of gratitude, relief, and a growing affection that she could no longer deny. He had risked everything for her, his honor, his duty, his life. He had chosen to stand by her, to protect her, even if it meant facing the wrath of the king, the might of Ashworth's army, the consequences of his actions. "But your oath," she stammered, her voice trembling. "You said you were bound to the king, that you couldn't defy him." He smiled, a sad, wistful smile. "Oaths can be broken," he said softly. "And sometimes they must be, for a greater good, for a higher purpose." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a deep, unwavering emotion. "I made another oath," he continued, his voice barely a whisper. "An oath to myself, to protect the innocent, to fight for what is right, to never again stand idly by while injustice prevails." He paused, his gaze shifting to the encampment below, his expression hardening. "And Ashworth, he is not innocent. He is a traitor, a rebel, a man who would usurp the throne, plunge the kingdom into chaos." He turned back to her, his gaze intense. "And you, Beatrice," he said, his voice filled with a tenderness that made her heart ache. "You are not just a pawn in his game. You are more, much more." He reached out, his hand gently touching her cheek, his fingers tracing the curve of her jaw. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing, savoring the warmth of his hand, the strength of his presence. "I will not let him have you," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "I will not let him harm you. I will protect you with my life." He leaned in, his lips brushing against hers, a soft, tentative kiss that sent shivers down her spine. It was a kiss of promise, of hope, of a love that had defied all odds, that had blossomed in the midst of darkness and danger. But the moment was short-lived. A sudden noise, the sound of approaching horses, shattered the intimacy, bringing them back to the harsh reality of their situation. Geoffrey pulled away, his hand going to his sword, his eyes scanning the forest. "We have to go," he said, his voice urgent. "They've found us." He helped her onto his horse, mounting behind her, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. They rode off, disappearing into the darkness, leaving the ridge, the encampment, the threat of Ashworth's army behind them. They rode for hours, following the winding path, descending back into the valley, towards the village that Beatrice had seen from the ridge. The village was their only hope, their only chance of finding refuge, of gathering allies, of preparing for the inevitable confrontation. As they rode, Geoffrey began to explain his plan, his strategy for dealing with Ashworth, with the rebellion, with the forces that were threatening to tear the kingdom apart. He revealed that he had been secretly communicating with other loyal lords, with those who opposed Ashworth's treachery, who remained true to the king. He had been gathering intelligence, assessing the situation, preparing for the inevitable conflict. He also told her more about the Order of the Serpent, the secret society that he believed was behind the plot, the hooded figure she had encountered in the passage. He had learned that they were a powerful, ancient organization, with roots that stretched back to the pagan past, to the worship of the old gods. He believed that Ashworth was a member of the Order, that he was using their dark magic, their influence, to further his own ambitions. He also suspected that the hooded figure was one of their leaders, a powerful sorcerer, a dangerous enemy. Beatrice listened intently, her mind racing. She realized that she had stumbled into something far more complex, far more dangerous, than she had ever imagined. This was not just a personal feud, a forced marriage. This was a battle for the soul of the kingdom, a clash between good and evil, between loyalty and betrayal. As they approached the village, Geoffrey reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping the surroundings. "We must be careful," he said, his voice low and cautious. "Ashworth has spies everywhere. We don't know who we can trust." They entered the village quietly, avoiding the main streets, sticking to the shadows. They found an abandoned stable on the outskirts of the village and took shelter there. Geoffrey unsaddled his horse, tending to the animal's needs, while Beatrice sat down on a pile of straw, her body exhausted, her mind reeling. He joined her, sitting beside her, his arm wrapping around her, drawing her close. "We'll rest here for a few hours," he said, his voice soft, reassuring. "Then we'll move on. We have allies waiting for us." The warmth in his eyes belied the worry in his tone. "Geoffrey," she began, and then stopped, wondering if it was wise to unveil her own secret.
But she had to.
She had to trust him. "The markings in the passage," she began. "I think I know who the hooded figure is." She felt, rather than saw, him tense. Chapter 15. A Knight's Confession. Geoffrey's arm tightened around her, his body stiffening with a sudden, palpable tension. He looked at her, his eyes searching hers, his expression a mixture of disbelief and apprehension. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. "How could you possibly know who the hooded figure is?" Beatrice took a deep breath, steeling herself for his reaction. She knew this would be difficult, that he might not believe her, that it might even drive a wedge between them. But she had to tell him, she had to share the burden of her knowledge, the secret she had carried for so long. "The markings," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They weren't just random symbols. They were a message, a story, and I recognized them." She paused, her gaze shifting to the floor, unable to meet his intense stare. "When I was a child," she continued, her voice barely a whisper, "I used to spend hours in the library at Blackmere. I loved to read, to explore the old books and scrolls. And I found a hidden chamber, a secret room filled with ancient texts, with forbidden knowledge." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. "And in that chamber, I found a book, a grimoire, that described the Order of the Serpent, their rituals, their symbols, their history." She paused again, her heart pounding in her chest. And I saw the same markings, the same symbols that I saw in the passage. And I read about their leader, their high priest, a man known only as the Shadowbinder. Geoffrey stared at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak, didn't move, his body frozen in place. She couldn't tell if he believed her, if he was angry, or if he was simply stunned. The Shadowbinder, he said finally, his voice a low murmur, as if repeating the name to himself, testing its weight, its meaning. I've heard whispers of that name, he said after a moment. Legends. Rumors. But I never believed. He shook his head, his expression troubled. But how can you be sure? He asked, his voice filled with doubt. How can you know that the hooded figure is this Shadowbinder? Beatrice took another deep breath, preparing herself for the most difficult part of her confession. Because, she said, her voice barely audible, I've seen him before. Not in the passage, but in my dreams. She closed her eyes, her body trembling, as the memories flooded back, the nightmares that had haunted her for years, the terrifying visions of the hooded figure, the blood-stained knife, the dark rituals. Ever since I found that book, she continued, her voice choked with emotion, I've had nightmares. Visions of the Shadowbinder, of his followers, of their dark magic. And I saw his face. In my dreams. It was the same face I saw in the passage. She opened her eyes, looking at Geoffrey, her gaze pleading for him to believe her, to understand. I know it sounds crazy, she said, her voice desperate, but it's true. I know it's him. Geoffrey remained silent for a long moment, his gaze searching hers. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the struggle between his reason, his logic, and the growing sense of unease, of dread, that was creeping into his soul. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and serious. If what you say is true, he said, then we are in even greater danger than I thought. The Shadowbinder is not just a sorcerer, a priest of the old gods. He is a master of illusion, of deception, of manipulation. He can twist your mind, control your thoughts, make you see things that aren't there. He paused, his gaze intense. And he has a particular interest in you, Beatrice. I don't know why, but I fear for your safety, for your sanity. He reached out, his hand gently touching her face, his fingers tracing the curve of her cheek. I will protect you, he said, his voice filled with a fierce determination. I will not let him harm you. I will not let him take you. His words, meant to be reassuring, sent a shiver down her spine. She knew that the Shadowbinder was a powerful enemy, that he was not easily defeated. And she feared that Geoffrey, despite his strength, his courage, his love for her, might not be able to protect her from him. The sound of horses whinnying cut short the moment. Geoffrey rose, his hand on his sword. Stay here, he murmured before going to investigate. He returned a moment later, with a man, tall and heavily built, wearing the simple clothes of a farmer, but with a sword strapped to his side. This is Gareth, Geoffrey said. One of my men. He has been watching the village. He has news. Gareth gave a short bow. My lord. Lady Beatrice. Ashworth's men are searching for you. They know you are close. And he paused, his face grim. They have brought someone with them. A sorcerer. Matching the description. Beatrice felt it then, a pull deep in her mind. A darkness. The Shadowbinder. Chapter 16. Flames of Rebellion. The news hit Beatrice like a physical blow. The Shadowbinder, here, with Ashworth's men, searching for her. The tendrils of fear that had been creeping around the edges of her mind tightened their grip, threatening to suffocate her. She felt a cold dread seep into her bones, a sense of impending doom that she couldn't shake. Geoffrey, sensing her fear, placed a reassuring hand on her arm. Don't worry, he said, his voice low and steady. We won't let them find you. We'll get you to safety. But even as he spoke, Beatrice could see the doubt in his eyes, the unspoken fear that mirrored her own. He knew, as she did, that they were facing a formidable enemy, a sorcerer of immense power, a master of illusion and deception. Gareth, oblivious to the deeper currents of their conversation, continued his report. Ashworth's men are spreading rumors, he said, his voice grim. They're telling the villagers that Lady Beatrice is a witch, a sorceress, that she has bewitched Sir Geoffrey, that she is plotting to overthrow the king. Beatrice gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A witch? She exclaimed. But that's insane. Geoffrey nodded, his expression dark. It's a clever tactic, he said. Ashworth is using fear and superstition to turn the people against us, to isolate us, to make it easier to capture you. He turned to Gareth. How many men does Ashworth have? He asked. At least 100, Gareth replied. Maybe more. They're well armed, well equipped. And they have the sorcerer, he trailed off, his gaze shifting to Beatrice, his expression filled with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Geoffrey sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. We're outnumbered, outmatched, he said. We can't fight them here in the village. We have to get out, to find a place to regroup, to gather our allies. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a fierce determination. We'll go to the Silverwood, he said. It's a day's ride from here, a hidden valley, a place of ancient power. It's said to be protected by spirits, by the old gods. It's our best chance of finding sanctuary, of evading Ashworth and his sorcerer. Beatrice nodded, her mind racing. The Silverwood, she had read about it in the ancient texts, in the forbidden books she had found in the hidden chamber at Blackmere. It was said to be a place of magic, of mystery, a place where the veil between the worlds was thin, where the spirits of nature roamed free. It was a dangerous place, a place of unknown forces, but it was also their only hope. They left the village under cover of darkness, Gareth leading the way, guiding them through the back streets, avoiding the main roads, the patrols of Ashworth's men. They rode swiftly, silently, their hearts pounding in their chests, their senses on high alert. As they rode, Beatrice felt a growing sense of unease, a feeling that they were being watched, that the Shadowbinder was aware of their every move, that he was toying with them, playing a cat-and-mouse game. She glanced over her shoulder repeatedly, expecting to see him, to see his hooded figure emerge from the shadows, his blood-stained knife gleaming in the moonlight. But she saw nothing. Only the trees, the darkness, the shadows. They reached the edge of the forest, the boundary of the Silverwood. Geoffrey reined in his horse, his gaze sweeping the surroundings. We must be careful, he said, his voice low and cautious. The Silverwood is unpredictable. It has its own rules, its own guardians. He dismounted, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of concern and something else. Was it awe? Or reverence? Stay close to me, he said. And, whatever you do, don't stray from the path. They entered the Silverwood, the trees closing in around them, the darkness deepening, the silence becoming absolute, broken only by the rustle of leaves, the hoot of an owl, the faint whisper of the wind. The air was different here, charged with a strange energy, a sense of ancient power, of unseen forces. Beatrice felt a tingling sensation on her skin, a prickling of her hair, as if she were walking through a field of electricity. The path was narrow, winding, barely visible in the dim light. The trees were tall, their branches intertwined, blocking out the moonlight, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to dance and writhe around them. As they walked, Beatrice felt a growing sense of dread, a feeling that they were being watched, that something was waiting for them. Suddenly, the forest erupted in flames. Trees burst into fire, the flames leaping high into the sky, illuminating the darkness with a terrifying, unholy light. The heat was intense, the air filled with smoke, with the acrid smell of burning wood. Beatrice screamed, her body recoiling from the heat, from the sudden, unexpected attack. She looked around, her eyes wide with terror, searching for the source of the flames. And then she saw him, standing amidst the burning trees, his hooded figure silhouetted against the inferno, his arms raised, his hands glowing with a strange, ethereal light. It was the Shadowbinder, and he had found them. His laughter echoed through the burning forest. Chapter 17. The Weight of Crowns. The The Shadowbinder's laughter was a chilling sound, a mocking, triumphant cackle that echoed through the burning forest, amplifying the terror, the chaos, the sense of impending doom. Beatrice felt her knees weaken, her body trembling uncontrollably. She wanted to run, to hide, to escape the inferno, the sorcerer's wrath, but she was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. Geoffrey, however, reacted instantly. He drew his sword, the steel gleaming in the firelight, his face set in a mask of grim determination. He stepped in front of Beatrice, shielding her from the flames, from the Shadowbinder's gaze. "Run, Beatrice," he shouted, his voice barely audible above the roar of the fire. "Get out of here. Find Gareth. He'll know what to do." But Beatrice couldn't move, couldn't leave him to face the sorcerer alone. She knew that Geoffrey was a skilled warrior, a courageous knight, but she also knew that the Shadowbinder was a formidable enemy, a master of dark magic, of forces beyond human comprehension.
"No,"
she cried, her voice hoarse with fear. "I won't leave you. We'll fight him together." Geoffrey turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of love and desperation. "You don't understand," he said, his voice urgent. "He's too powerful. You can't fight him. You have to go.
Now."
He pushed her, gently but firmly, towards the path, towards the darkness beyond the burning trees. She stumbled, almost falling, but she regained her balance and started to run, her heart pounding in her chest, her lungs burning with smoke. She didn't look back, didn't dare to see what was happening behind her. She just ran, blindly, desperately, through the forest, her mind filled with terror, with the image of Geoffrey facing the Shadowbinder, with the sound of the sorcerer's laughter echoing in her ears. She found Gareth a short distance away, his face pale and worried, his horse rearing in fright, its eyes wide with terror. "My lady," he exclaimed, his voice filled with relief. "You're alive. What happened? Where's Sir Geoffrey?" Beatrice tried to explain, the words tumbling out in a jumbled rush, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She told him about the fire, the Shadowbinder, Geoffrey's desperate attempt to save her. Gareth listened, his expression growing grimmer with each passing moment. "We have to go back," he said, his voice firm, resolute. "We have to help him." But even as he spoke, they heard a sound, a terrifying roar that shook the very ground beneath their feet. It was the sound of a battle, of steel clashing against steel, of magic colliding with magic, of a desperate struggle between good and evil. Beatrice knew that it was Geoffrey, fighting for his life, fighting for her, fighting for the fate of the kingdom. And she knew that she couldn't abandon him, couldn't leave him to face the Shadowbinder alone. "No," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "We have to go back. We have to help him. I have to help him." She turned and started to run back towards the burning forest, towards the sound of the battle, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind filled with a mixture of fear and determination. Gareth, after a moment's hesitation, followed her, his sword drawn, his face set in a mask of grim resolve. They reached the edge of the burning forest, the heat intense, the air thick with smoke. They could see the figures of Geoffrey and the Shadowbinder, locked in a desperate struggle, their forms silhouetted against the inferno. Geoffrey was holding his own, his sword flashing in the firelight, deflecting the Shadowbinder's attacks, his movements fluid and graceful, despite the heavy armor he wore. But he was tiring, his strength waning, his defenses weakening. The Shadowbinder, on the other hand, seemed to be growing stronger, his power fueled by the flames, by the chaos, by the darkness. He was casting spells, summoning creatures of shadow, of fire, to attack Geoffrey, to overwhelm him. Beatrice knew that Geoffrey couldn't hold out much longer, that he was on the verge of defeat. She had to do something, anything, to help him. She remembered the ancient texts, the forbidden knowledge she had learned in the hidden chamber at Blackmere. She remembered the rituals, the spells, the incantations that were said to ward off evil, to banish darkness, to protect the innocent. She closed her eyes, her mind focusing, her body trembling. She began to chant, her voice low and hesitant at first, then growing stronger, more confident, more powerful. She chanted the words of protection, of banishment, of light, her voice rising above the roar of the fire, above the sound of the battle, above the Shadowbinder's laughter. As she chanted, she felt a surge of energy, a tingling sensation that spread through her body, a sense of power, of connection to something ancient, something primal, something divine. The flames around the Shadowbinder began to flicker, to diminish, to recede. The creatures of shadow, of fire, that he had summoned began to dissipate, to fade away, to return to the darkness from whence they came. The Shadowbinder, his power weakened, his concentration broken, stumbled, faltered. Geoffrey, seeing his opportunity, lunged forward, his sword striking true, piercing the sorcerer's heart. The Shadowbinder screamed, a chilling, inhuman sound that echoed through the forest. His body convulsed, his form flickering, then dissolving into nothingness, leaving only a faint scent of sulfur, of decay, in the air. The fire began to die down, the flames receding, the smoke clearing. Geoffrey stood there, his sword dripping with the Shadowbinder's blood, his body exhausted, his face pale, but his eyes filled with a triumphant light. He had won, but at what cost? The weight of that victory was written across his strained features. Chapter 18. Where Honor Lies. The silence that followed the Shadowbinder's demise was profound, broken only by the crackling of the remaining embers and the heavy breathing of Geoffrey and Gareth. Beatrice ran to Geoffrey, her heart pounding with relief and a lingering fear that clung to her like the scent of smoke. He sheathed his sword, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a mixture of exhaustion, relief, and a deep, abiding love. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She nodded, unable to speak, tears streaming down her face. She threw her arms around him, holding him tight, burying her face in his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own. He held her close, his arms wrapping around her, his body trembling with the aftershocks of the battle, with the release of tension, with the overwhelming emotion of the moment. Gareth, standing a short distance away, watched them, his expression a mixture of relief and awe. He had witnessed something extraordinary, something that transcended the realm of ordinary combat, something that spoke of ancient powers, of magic, of a force beyond human comprehension. After a long moment, Geoffrey gently pulled away from Beatrice, his gaze searching hers. "How did you do that?" he asked, his voice filled with wonder. "How did you banish him?" Beatrice wiped away her tears, her mind still reeling from the experience, from the power that had surged through her, from the connection she had felt to the ancient forces of the Silverwood. "I don't know," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I just remembered the words, the chants from the old books. I felt something powerful, something ancient guiding me." She looked around, at the remnants of the burning forest, at the evidence of the Shadowbinder's destructive power, at the lingering scent of sulfur and decay. "This place," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The Silverwood, it's alive. It's sentient.
It had helped me."
Geoffrey nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I've heard the legends," he said. "The stories of the old gods, of the spirits that dwell in this forest. I never believed them until now." He looked at Beatrice, his eyes filled with a new respect and new understanding. "You have a gift, Beatrice," he said. "A power that you don't fully understand. A power that could be dangerous." He paused, his gaze shifting to Gareth, then back to her. "We have to leave this place," he said. "We have to get to safety, to regroup, to plan our next move." They left the Silverwood, the remnants of the fire still smoldering behind them, the memory of the battle, of the Shadowbinder's defeat, etched in their minds. They rode for hours, heading north, away from Ashworth's forces, away from the immediate danger, towards a hidden valley, a refuge where Geoffrey's allies were waiting for them. As they rode, Geoffrey began to explain his plan, his strategy for dealing with Ashworth, with the rebellion, with the forces that were threatening to tear the kingdom apart. He revealed that he had been in contact with several loyal lords, nobles who opposed Ashworth's treachery, who remained true to the king. He had been gathering support, building an alliance, preparing for a counteroffensive. He also told her that the king was not as weak, as oblivious, as everyone believed. He was aware of Ashworth's plot, of the rebellion, and he was secretly supporting Geoffrey's efforts, providing him with resources, with intelligence, with the authority to act on his behalf. "The king trusts me," Geoffrey said, his voice filled with a quiet pride. "He knows that I am loyal, that I will not betray him, that I will fight for the crown, for the kingdom." He paused, his gaze shifting to Beatrice, his expression softening.
"And he knows about you, Beatrice," he said.
"He knows about your courage, your strength, your gift."
"And he wants to meet you."
Beatrice stared at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "The king?" she exclaimed. "He wants to meet me?" Geoffrey nodded, a faint smile touching his lips.
"He believes that you are important," he said.
"That you have a role to play in this conflict. That you are a symbol of hope, of resistance, of the power of good against evil." Beatrice felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of fear and excitement, of doubt and determination. She had never imagined herself as a leader, as a symbol, as a warrior. She had always been just Beatrice, the Lady of Blackmere, a pawn in the game of power, a victim of circumstance. But now, everything had changed. She had discovered a hidden power within herself, a connection to the ancient forces of the world, a destiny that she had never anticipated. She looked at Geoffrey, her eyes filled with a newfound resolve. "I will meet him," she said, her voice firm, determined. "I will do whatever it takes to help you, to defeat Ashworth, to save the kingdom." He smiled, his eyes filled with admiration, with love. "I knew you would," he said. "I knew you were extraordinary." They rode on, and discussed what their next steps would be. Where honor truly lay. Not with crowns, but with courage. Chapter 19. The Heart's Citadel. The journey to the hidden valley was arduous, the terrain rugged and unforgiving, the weather cold and harsh. But Beatrice and Geoffrey, accompanied by the loyal Gareth, pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency, by the knowledge that the fate of the kingdom hung in the balance. They reached the valley at dawn, a secluded haven nestled amidst towering peaks, shrouded in mist and ancient trees. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, of serene tranquility, a stark contrast to the chaos and violence they had left behind. The valley was also a stronghold, a fortified encampment where Geoffrey's allies had gathered, awaiting his arrival. There were knights, men-at-arms, archers, and scouts, all loyal to the king, all determined to resist Ashworth's rebellion. They were greeted with cheers, with expressions of relief and gratitude, with a renewed sense of hope. Geoffrey was their leader, their inspiration, their champion, and his return, along with Beatrice, was a sign that the tide was turning, that the forces of good were gathering, preparing to strike back. Beatrice was introduced to the assembled lords and knights, men of honor and courage, who had pledged their lives, their fortunes, their loyalty to the king, to the cause of justice. They welcomed her with respect, with admiration, with a recognition of the role she had played, of the power she possessed. She felt a sense of belonging, of purpose, that she had never experienced before. She was no longer just a pawn, a victim, a refugee. She was a warrior, a leader, a symbol of hope, a part of something larger than herself, something meaningful, something worth fighting for. In the days that followed, Beatrice immersed herself in the preparations for the inevitable conflict. She learned about strategy, about tactics, about the art of war. She also continued to explore her own powers, her connection to the ancient forces of the world, her ability to tap into the magic that flowed through the silverwood, through the earth, through her very being. She practiced her chants, her incantations, her rituals, under the guidance of an old woman, a wise woman, who lived in the valley, a keeper of ancient knowledge, a guardian of the old gods. The old woman, whose name was Morwen, taught Beatrice how to control her powers, how to channel them, how to use them for good, for protection, for healing. She also warned her about the dangers of magic, of the temptations of darkness, of the importance of maintaining balance, of staying true to her heart, to her conscience. Beatrice listened intently, absorbing the old woman's wisdom, learning from her experience, growing in strength, in confidence, in her understanding of herself, of her destiny. She also spent time with Geoffrey, strengthening their bond, deepening their love, finding solace and comfort in each other's presence, in their shared commitment to the cause, to the kingdom. They talked about their past, their fears, their hopes, their dreams. They shared their secrets, their vulnerabilities, their innermost thoughts, their deepest desires. Geoffrey told her about his childhood, about his father, about his exile, about the pain and injustice he had endured. He also told her about his love for her, about how she had changed his life, how she had given him hope, how she had inspired him to fight, to believe in himself, to believe in the possibility of a better future. Beatrice told him about her own childhood, about her forced betrothal, about her escape, about her encounter with the Shadowbinder, about the nightmares that had haunted her for years. She also told him about her love for him, about how he had given her strength, how he had protected her, how he had shown her what it meant to be truly loved, truly free. They made plans for the future, for a life beyond the conflict, beyond the war, a life together, a life of peace, of happiness, of love. But they also knew that the future was uncertain, that the battle ahead would be fierce, that the outcome was far from guaranteed. They knew that they might not survive, that they might be separated, that their dreams might be shattered. But they faced their fears together, their love a shield against the darkness, their courage a beacon of hope in the storm. As the day of the battle approached, Beatrice felt a growing sense of anticipation, of dread, of determination. She was ready. She would fight. She would stand by Geoffrey's side. She would use her powers. She would do whatever it took to defeat Ashworth, to save the kingdom, to secure their future. She went to the highest point, overlooking the valley, and looked down at the people that were gathered. Her people. And her heart swelled. It was a citadel unlike any she had known. Chapter 20. A vow renewed. The dawn of the battle broke cold and clear, the sky a pale, washed-out blue, the air crisp and still. The valley, once a haven of peace, was now a hive of activity, the air filled with the clang of metal, the murmur of voices, the nervous whinnying of horses. Beatrice stood beside Geoffrey on a raised platform, overlooking the assembled army. They were a smaller force than Ashworth's, but they were united, determined, their hearts filled with a righteous fire, a belief in their cause, in their leader, in each other. Geoffrey, clad in shining armor, his sword at his side, addressed the troops, his voice strong and resonant, echoing through the valley. He spoke of honor, of duty, of loyalty, of the need to defend the kingdom, to protect the innocent, to defeat the forces of darkness that threatened to engulf them. He spoke of Beatrice, of her courage, of her strength, of her power, of the role she had played in their struggle, of the hope she represented. He presented her to the army, not as a pawn, not as a prize, but as a warrior, a leader, a symbol of their resistance. The army cheered, their voices raised in a thunderous roar, their swords and spears held high, their hearts filled with a fierce determination, a willingness to fight, to die, for their cause, for their kingdom, for their freedom. Beatrice felt a surge of emotion, a mixture of pride and humility, of fear and excitement, of love and gratitude. She had never imagined herself in this role, as a leader, as an inspiration, as a warrior. But she embraced it, she accepted it, she knew that it was her destiny, her purpose. She stepped forward, raising her hand, her voice clear and strong, echoing through the valley. She spoke of the old gods, of the power of nature, of the magic that flowed through the earth, through the silverwood, through her very being. She spoke of the need to protect the balance, to preserve the ancient ways, to resist the darkness that threatened to consume them. She chanted an ancient incantation, a prayer to the old gods, a plea for protection, for strength, for victory. As she chanted, she felt a surge of energy, a tingling sensation that spread through her body, a connection to the ancient forces of the world, a sense of power, of purpose, of destiny. The army responded, their voices joining hers, their hearts filled with a renewed sense of hope, of courage, of faith. They were ready. They would fight. They would win. The battle began at midday, Ashworth's forces advancing across the open plain, a vast, seemingly unstoppable tide of steel and flesh. Geoffrey's army met them head-on, a smaller but more determined force, their lines holding firm, their courage unwavering. The clash of steel, the roar of battle cries, the screams of the wounded, the thunder of hooves, filled the air, a cacophony of violence, of chaos, of death. Beatrice fought alongside Geoffrey, her powers complementing his strength, her magic weaving a protective shield around them, deflecting blows, banishing shadows, inspiring courage, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. She saw Gareth fall, his body pierced by a spear, his face contorted in pain, his eyes filled with a final, defiant glare. She saw other brave men and women fall, their lives sacrificed for the cause, for the kingdom, for their freedom. She felt their pain, their loss, their sacrifice, but she did not falter. She did not waver. She fought on, her heart filled with a righteous fury, a determination to avenge their deaths, to defeat the forces of darkness, to secure a better future. The battle raged for hours, the outcome uncertain, the balance shifting back and forth, the tide of war ebbing and flowing. But gradually, slowly, Geoffrey's forces began to gain the upper hand, their courage, their determination, their unity, their belief in their cause, prevailing over Ashworth's superior numbers, his dark magic, his treachery. Ashworth, seeing his army faltering, his plans unraveling, rode to the front lines, his face a mask of fury, his eyes burning with a desperate, reckless rage. He sought out Geoffrey, his nemesis, his rival, the man who stood between him and his ambition, his desire for power, for the throne. They met in the center of the battlefield, their horses colliding, their swords clashing, their bodies locked in a desperate struggle, a final confrontation between good and evil, between loyalty and betrayal, between love and hate. Geoffrey, fueled by his love for Beatrice, by his commitment to the kingdom, by his unwavering belief in justice, fought with a strength, a skill, a courage that he had never known before. He parried Ashworth's blows, he deflected his attacks, he pressed him back, he forced him to retreat. Finally, with a mighty blow, Geoffrey disarmed Ashworth, his sword flying through the air, landing harmlessly on the blood-soaked ground. He stood over him, his sword raised, ready to deliver the final blow, to end the rebellion, to secure the victory. But he hesitated. He looked at Ashworth, his face contorted in fear, in defeat, in despair. He saw not a monster, not a demon, but a man, a flawed, broken, misguided man, a victim of his own ambition, of his own darkness. He lowered his sword. He could not kill him, not in cold blood, not without a trial, not without justice. "I yield," Ashworth said, his voice hoarse, his body trembling. "I surrender." The battle was over. Geoffrey had won. The rebellion was crushed. The kingdom was saved. Beatrice ran to Geoffrey, throwing her arms around him, her tears of joy mingling with his sweat and blood. They embraced, their love a beacon of hope in the aftermath of the carnage, a testament to the power of good, of courage, of unity. But as they stood, clasped in each other's arms, a shadow fell over them. A figure emerged, slow and cruel, with a smile full of triumph. Lord Ashworth. And behind him, two of his men, holding a struggling Alara. "Did you think it was that easy, de Moray?" Ashworth sneered, his voice echoing. Geoffrey turned, stunned, his face stricken. "Alara?" He took a step, but stopped as Ashworth pressed a dagger to her throat. "One more step, and she dies." Ashworth's eyes were wild. "A trade, then." "The witch, for my loyal servant. And we depart in peace." Beatrice felt a cold dread wash over her. She looked at Geoffrey and saw his answer. Even with the dawning horror in her, she understood. He nodded slowly. Agreed. Ashworth's smile widened. He gave a signal, and his men roughly shoved Alara forward. She stumbled, and Geoffrey rushed to catch her, to help her. And in that moment, Ashworth lunged, not at Geoffrey, but at Beatrice. He grabbed her, pulling her close, his dagger now at her throat. "Fool," he hissed. "You think I would let you live? You think I care for anything but victory?" Beatrice struggled, but his grip was too strong. She looked at Geoffrey, her eyes filled with terror, with apology, with love. Geoffrey stood, frozen, his face a mask of horror, of helplessness. Ashworth laughed, a cruel, triumphant sound. "I win, de Moray. This final vow, the truest vow, is mine," and then he plunged the dagger towards her heart. But it never connected. A shield, shimmering and golden, sprung into existence between them, deflecting the blow. Ashworth recoiled, his eyes wide with disbelief, with fear. Beatrice, empowered by love, by desperation, by the ancient magic that flowed through her, had summoned the strength, the will, to protect herself. She pushed Ashworth away, her hands glowing with power, her eyes burning with a righteous fury. She raised her hand, and a bolt of pure energy struck him, throwing him back, his body crashing to the ground, lifeless. Silence descended upon the battlefield. The fighting had stopped. Everyone stared, stunned, at Beatrice, at the power she had unleashed, at the victory she had secured. Geoffrey rushed to her, embracing her, his body trembling with relief, with love, with awe. "You saved us," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "You saved us all." Beatrice, exhausted but triumphant, leaned against him, her heart filled with a profound sense of peace, of fulfillment, of destiny realized. The vow she had made, to herself, to Geoffrey, to the kingdom, was fulfilled. And a new vow, a vow of love, of unity, of a future filled with hope, was forged in the fires of battle, in the crucible of sacrifice. And it would never be broken. Epilogue. The years that followed the battle were a time of healing, of rebuilding, of forging a new era of peace and prosperity for the kingdom. The scars of the rebellion remained, etched on the land, on the hearts of the people, but they served as a reminder of the price of freedom, of the importance of unity, of the power of courage and love. Geoffrey and Beatrice returned to Moray, not as exiles, not as prisoners, but as heroes, as saviors, as the rightful rulers of the North. The fortress, once a symbol of isolation and despair, became a beacon of hope, a center of justice, a place of refuge for those in need. The king, grateful for their service, for their loyalty, for their sacrifice, bestowed upon them titles, lands, and honors. But Geoffrey and Beatrice valued something far greater than worldly possessions, than power, than prestige. They valued their love, their bond, their shared commitment to each other, to their people, to the kingdom. They ruled wisely and justly, guided by the principles of compassion, of fairness, of respect for all. They fostered trade, encouraged agriculture, supported the arts and sciences, creating a society where all could thrive, where all could find peace and happiness. Beatrice continued to explore her powers, her connection to the ancient magic of the world, under the guidance of Morwen, the wise woman of the Silverwood. She learned to control her abilities, to use them for good, for healing, for protection, becoming a respected and beloved figure, a guardian of the balance, a bridge between the human and the supernatural realms. Alara, recovered from her ordeal, remained at Moray, serving as Beatrice's confidant, her advisor, her friend. She had been more than a housekeeper, more than a servant. She had been a spy, a secret ally, working tirelessly behind the scenes to undermine Ashworth's plot, to protect Geoffrey and Beatrice, to ensure the victory of the Loyalists. Her bravery, her loyalty, her unwavering commitment to the cause were finally recognized, rewarded, and honored. The secret passages of Moray were sealed, their entrances hidden, their existence forgotten, becoming a part of the fortress's legend, a whispered tale of a darker time, of a hidden danger, of a brave lady who adventured into the unknown and emerged victorious. Geoffrey and Beatrice had children, strong sons and wise daughters, who inherited their parents' courage, their intelligence, their love for their people, for their land. They grew up hearing the stories of the rebellion, of the battle, of the Shadowbinder, of the heroic deeds of their parents, learning the lessons of the past, preparing themselves for the challenges of the future. And as the years turned into decades, and the decades into centuries, the story of Geoffrey and Beatrice became a legend, a tale told and retold around campfires and hearths, in castles and cottages, a testament to the power of love, of courage, of unity, of the enduring strength of the human spirit. A reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope can flourish, that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, good can triumph over evil, that even a forced marriage can blossom into a love that saves a kingdom. The Winter Lord and his lady, forever bound by a vow renewed, a vow of love, of loyalty, of a future forged in the fires of adversity, a future where their names would be whispered with reverence, with gratitude, with love, for generations to come. The end.